And people always attribute the value to that rise as you talk about the breakthrough moment.
Mm-hmm.
However, if you look at it and think of the plateau is where you're actually not spending time plateauing, but you're actually spending time trying to find the next breakthrough.
Correct.
And welcome back to the Money, the Mindset, and the Mentoring podcast. Today we have John Chan with us here out of Vancouver, Canada. Welcome to the show, brother.
Thank you for having me, Steve.
Hey, man, thank you. And you're of the 2x Agency is the name of your company. But I want to first start off talking about my favorite thing, and that we really kind of hit at the beginning was a mindset thing that comes around really coming out of a martial arts background. And I think that, to me, is really an interesting starting point for us to hit. So let's talk a little bit about the martial arts community. And you started off in Taekwondo, and you actually hit a pretty darn high level, too. Let's share a little bit about that.
That's right. I mean, it's one of those things where, like, I grew up watching. My dad was really into martial arts, being an Asian dude, right? He, it's funny because, like, it was one of those things where he was really into, like, reading poetry and education and make sure that we're strong academically, but he also wanted to make sure that so I'm the youngest of three kids, right? So I'm the third child, but he wanted all of us to be in martial arts, and so put me in when I was
the
6.
Philosopher warrior.
Yeah, for sure. Exactly. And if you look at the history behind it, there's a lot of nuance behind it. It actually makes a lot of sense because the people that can fight, people that can understand how to navigate battlefields and also know how to navigate strategically, they fare very well. And so in a way, in the modern society, we don't really have the same sort of conditions, environments where that's kind of needed. But where it translates very well is the practical aspects of how does martial arts apply into cross domains. If you think about business, I ask you the same thing. How does it come across? And you'll see all these lessons and interesting that comes along with it. But martial arts for me, for the most fundamental level, gave me a sense of progression for what it goes from, basics and how to get to black belt. And for a lot of people that are in martial arts, that mastery, they think black belt is where it ends, but getting a black belt is where it starts, because that's where you've done our fundamentals, and that's where the real training begins.
Now, how long did you train in Taekwondo?
So I started when I was 6, and I retired when I was 25. So I'm 36 this year, 37 this year. So it was about 10 years ago when I stopped. But I was competing nationally between 2003 to 2012.
Yeah, and you won some titles too on that.
That's right. So I won national championship titles for Pumse, which is like forms. But I was at I represented Team Canada for the first World Pumse competition. So that was in Korea in 2006. I would compete for Team Canada at the World University Games in 2007 and then again in 2011.
And those were the forms was the one, but you also did the combatives as well.
That's right. It was Olympic sparring.
As Olympic sparring, yeah. That's one of those things that some martial arts get a bad rap because of the forms, and people look at that and like that's not actually fighting. It's a movement, and then seeing the practical application is what people are really looking for. What's your thoughts when people look at that and have that kind of a conversation?
I mean, what people say what they want to say, right? Realistically, is when you go through the emotions and you understand the psychology behind it. I mean, I'll go from the sparring first, because one of the first major lessons I learned in Olympic sparring was that 90% of the game was mental, 10% of it was physical. So when you're going out to compete with the other person, you got 2 arms and 2 legs, the other guy's got 2 arms and 2 legs, but the person that was mentally on, and your training is going to be spot on in a lot of different cases. Everyone's training very hard at that sort of like world-class level. What really makes a fundamental difference between how you perform at that world stage is, yes, you're training in background, you're coaching your strategies, but a large part of it comes down to performance. And you have like bad beats and upsets, largely because how someone performs on the day of the match. And so when you look at forms is less about, the way that it visually looks, because people look at it from the physical side of it and they're like, well, that's not practical. If you look at wushu, right, you can do all these like fancy moves and all this type of things, but how does it actually work in battle? And realistically, it's not about that. It's more about the if you think about it in terms of like an art or dance, it's about the kinetic movements and how well you can control your body. So that should you need to move it in a very precise way, how could you do that? And so forms give you a structured way of practicing a set of movements so that you have a stronger coordination between your mind and your body, right? Coming from a place where I really appreciated that.
And it's interesting when you look at the movement in MMA or in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, the movement towards a higher focus on longer training sessions with less impact is almost really embracing the idea of the forms, because gone are the days. I mean, there's still some gyms out there where you go in and you just beat the hell out of each other in a sparring session, and everybody walks away, nice and healthily concussed, and call it a day and show up the next one. And now it's more of, they go in, they really get technical about their movements. It's really what they're just doing is team kata, really, at that point. It's both people are playing out their technique in a very controlled method. I think Taekwondo, when I watch Taekwondo matches at the highest level, I mean, it's so darn explosive. So you have to be precise. You're really playing like a very aggressive game of rock, paper, scissors.
You could say that, yeah.
Because it just happens so quickly.
You could say that.
I think it's beautiful to watch.
No, absolutely. And I think it's not just specific to Taekwondo. You look at other like martial arts, there's a lot of forms of it that they emphasize on forms and patterns. And it is what it is, right? At the end of the day, you don't I think if you just view it from a lens of practicality in a real street fight, then that's where a lot of the negativity and downplay comes from. But if you look at it as like outside of that window, there's other ways and reasons why someone uses that. At the end of the day, it's also a very good method for teaching someone the foundations and basics, because if you look at the movements in each of the forms, it's a progression. And martial arts has a very clear progression where you start from a white belt and you end, quote unquote, end at a black belt. But because there's a sense of progression, when you go into different fields where it's not as obvious how you go through these progressions, then you'll start seeing the reasons why it's laid out and designed in that particular way, so that if you learn into a particular field, let's say copywriting or marketing, there's no real sense of progression. How are you getting better? But because you can formulate your own set of progressions and you can lead from, skill trees in video games, it's like you learn this one basic thing that leads to the next thing. It helps you build upon your core fundamental skills to build on more advanced skills. That I think that's a really important thing that forms effectively give, whether if that's the structured form of teaching or if it's a form of art.
It's funny when you think about we bring in the games, and I always think it's interesting when you look at something like, I don't know, I'll talk about Warcraft, for example, because I'm an older guy. Warcraft was a big deal back in the day. And you'd go to like level 1 and then you go to level 60 and you're basically doing the same thing. You just have a different color of boar that you're trying to catch or a different skin of armor, but it's always the same thing as you move through. When you move and because the competition level is getting greater, when you find that there's that, as you get greater, you're getting greater competition. How does the mindset work around that? Because it is sort of the same thing, but it's just that your degree of difference between you and your competitors remaining the same as you're both getting better. Does that make sense?
It does, of course. So I think the way that would speak to that is, maybe in that particular case, gaming might be the best example. But if you think about the other fields that you get into, because we talked a little bit about this with chess. Like I'm enjoying chess a lot right now for the same reasons, because if you look at, we're not talking about work yet, right? But it's like, if you look at my career history, there was kind of like these 3 major arcs. I was a designer for a couple of years. I was a software programmer for the next couple of years. And right now I'm in the marketer phase. But in each of those progressions, I went from 0 to 60 really quickly because I kind of knew like what the progression was supposed to look like. And so, going back to, the progression to mastery, right? What happens is in the beginning of learning a new field or set of skills, the learning curve is, it could be very steep in the beginning, but once you get past a certain threshold, there's a bit of like an explosive sort of growth where I get the fundamentals now. It clicks. And then you can start absorbing a lot of the materials and, formulas or frameworks very quickly. And then they start becoming internalized. But once you get past the sort of the initial phase of the intermediate phase and you're starting to get to like more advanced levels and then the next phase of mastery, what you're going to find is that there's going to be maybe like long stretches of time where you feel like you're plateauing in that particular skill set. Where if you look at the things that you're doing on a maybe like on a smaller period, like, you know, on a quarterly or monthly basis, it doesn't feel like it's all that different. But you take a step back and you look at on a, you know, larger window, like 6 months in or a year in, you realize that you're actually progressing really, you know, quite a bit over time. But what actually happens is the learning period, unlike the initial stage of acquiring knowledge really quickly, the practicing of the fundamental stage looks like you're not really moving. It looks like you're plateauing, but there's spurts of breakthroughs where if you have a new concept or unlock, that suddenly the way that you approach it, I feel like it's just there's like a short burst of growth and then the plateau again. So it's more like in the beginning it was like it's a curve and then it becomes like, you know, slow and then very steep, and afterwards you plateau and then it becomes like a zigzag. And I think of that level because once you get to that sort of later stage and you know what to look for, you don't get frustrated about the plateaus. And when you go through the same motions of the same things over and over again, it feels like you're not moving. But next thing you know, you have a sudden breakthrough of like, oh, shoot, the thing I've been playing over and over again, I never thought about it that way before. And now that I understand what somebody has been telling me for this, you know, over a long period of time, now I have an unlock. Next thing you know, you have that little spurt of growth. And the next thing you know, you have that sort of the next breakthrough. And it's like, you got these like spurts of breakthroughs. And I think that's in a lot of any inherent field, and if you know to look for it, you know, it's one of those it's a very interesting progression, and so you start looking for it when you see it.
If you look at and I like that idea of rather than having a nice little hockey curve, it's more like stairs.
Yeah.
And people always attribute the value to that rise as you talk about the breakthrough moment.
Mm-hmm.
However, if you look at it and think of the plateau is where you're actually not spending time plateauing, but you're actually spending time trying to find the next breakthrough.
Correct.
And so it's just the stair length or depth of the stair, I guess you would say, is on the basis of the time it takes to find that next breakthrough.
100%.
And that gives you the rise. It also, I think it's also time when you stabilize the prior breakthrough. Mm-hmm. Because if you have a breakthrough, but it doesn't stabilize, it's going to be lost. I mean, I know when I do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, if it's one of those things where you're doing X guard for a little bit, you might lose a little bit of your side control if you don't kind of bring it back in again. So you got to stabilize that. You got to stabilize this and stabilize all the elements that you have in your game plan so that you're not losing as you're adding, you're gaining. It's a net gain. There's no 100%. Churn of ideas or churns of skill.
100%. And I think you articulated it better than I did in the sense that I've always understood it in that particular way, but it's these two phases of like, you're going through all the lessons and you're acquiring and remembering all the lessons, you know, over a certain period. But once you get into the practicing of said lessons, that's where the plateau begins. And it doesn't feel like you're getting a bit better at it. But if you know that's the duration that you're in, you're going to wait for that breakthrough, and you're going to have the patience to wait for that breakthrough. And then when you know it's there, it'll just...
Yeah. Now, what you got to the last phase, we're going to call it the last phase because you did exit the competitive space and you did exit Taekwondo. Do you train at all anymore in Taekwondo, or is it just gone?
I don't, and it's partly because part of the reason why I retired was because I busted my knee, right? And so I wanted to find a new sport or new thing to get into, and I think at the time too, because I retired when I was 25 or 26 or so. It was also like the turning point where things were progressing in my career, and the opportunity cost for, you know, the training and the dedication that I had in my early 20s was not the same in my later 20s. And so it was just...
How often were you training when you were at the highest level?
It was quite a bit. So I was probably training like at the peak, I was probably training 2 sessions a day. So like it was like the morning training and an afternoon, evening training. But between competition, like while I was working a full-time job, because there's not a really competitive, like the professional scene in Canada right now. I think there's more options for you to get sponsorships, for you to build an influencer sort of following around that kind of thing. But you know, back then there wasn't really any of that kind of thing. Yeah. And so I was probably training maybe like 4 times a week. So like outside of full-time jobs. And then Sunday was usually a break. So it'd be like Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and then Saturday. But it's like, but that's on a maintenance level. When you're competing, it's like, it gets a little bit more intense than that. So,
well, success follows attention, and you have to put as much attention into it as possible.
Yeah.
Time on the mat is so critical for success.
Yeah, but it's also at that level. It's not just time at the mat. It's also like the things you have to do outside of the mat, to outside in preparation, how you prepare your sleep, how you prepare your nutrition. It was it was lifestyle, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now you've now gone on, and as you said, you found a passion in things like chess, but then you also, let's talk a bit about the business side and
Sure.
the transitions that you made on that side.
Sure. So, the first start of my career was actually when I was doing. So I never finished school. So I was studying at UBC at the University of British Columbia as in fine arts, but I got disenchanted, and I think partly was because I found school slow for me at the time, and this was around 2006. So I was still competing at that time. I was doing all kinds of things, but on one of my tournaments, I came back. I was reading a book. I was reading Rich Dad Poor Dad, and that was kind of like the gateway drug to speak for entrepreneurship, because it solidified the idea that it didn't really matter what was on my resume, if that one bullet point of like having a bachelor's degree. And I ran an experiment for myself.
Now, just a second. You're in Vancouver.
Correct.
You're Asian.
Yes.
You didn't finish university. There's some stigma with that. There's stigma with that. That is
sure.
I did a podcast with a lady. It was talking specifically about that as a big challenge. But how did your parents react to that?
So it's one of those things where there was a few things that worked in my favor. The first one was that because I was competing and I was training at that particular level, I think it gave my parents a sense of assurance. It was more my mom, actually. My dad was, more okay with it. It was it gave my mom a sense of assurance that I wasn't really going to screw around and waste my time too much. But the second reason was also because, and a really big part of it also comes to the fact that I'm the third kid. So that when I have two older brothers, 7 to 8 years older than me, they both had the degrees. So by the time it comes to me, there's like
they had the 2 check marks. They don't need a third one.
There's an element of that, but there was a less sense of urgency, and I think that's also why my brother back then, he really championed for it, and he's always been a strong backer for me. And so between a combination of those things, it was an easier transition, and it worked out in the sense that when I first left school, this was December 2006, I started a freelance business doing web design, because that's the inventory of skills that I had at the time. And I quickly found out that even though I could make websites, the business mechanics of getting clients, doing project management, all those things are very much more difficult than I thought. And so 9 months in, after doing freelancing, I ended up taking a job back at UBC, because my first career was Timber, which came full circle. It didn't take that long for them to realize that, it worked out in my favor. And so and that was my initial pitch.
So you left university, then you got a job back at the university.
It's funny, exactly. That's exactly what happened. Because I my pitch, and
they didn't ask for university credentials?
No, it's not that they didn't, but of course it came up, right? And my response was, in the last 9 months or a year, me doing on my freelancing, I learned more in that one duration than I did in the 2 years before. So whatever you throw at me, I'm pretty sure I'll figure it out, and I'll be able to grow around it. And I did. Right. I started as like a junior. I started as an assistant. And within the 4 or 5 year span of working in an organization, I became their lead usability researcher. I was a lead user experience designer. I redesigned all the major interfaces. I did really well in that environment. Enough for me to cap out and say, you know what, what's next?
I think universities are under threat for sure if they don't innovate in the way that they create the experience of learning at the higher level.
I mean, I don't think it's going to be easy for people talk about this for decades now at this point, where it's like, education is fundamentally a problem. How are we going to fix it? And we all agree that it's a system designed from the industrial age of producing, mass production of students at a factory level, kind of like you go from one stage to the next. And I think, naturally the next progression would be, personalized education, where you tailor your education around the individual's strengths and weaknesses and all kinds of things. So I think that's well understood and at least talked about. But I don't think
technology is going to do an amazing pivot in that. I mean,
if
you wanted to have tailored to the individual, AI does a beautiful job of doing that.
In a sense, yes. Yes, in a sense, yes. But I think at the end of the day, it's going to come down to individual level, right? So I don't think university is going to change. I think the message to how people should learn and take the responsibility for themselves, I think, is the major sort of point, right? It's like if you want to get a class on like I just was looking at this the other day, right? Got an ad serve for masterclass, and I looked at the price. It's like $10 for all kinds of experts to teach you all kinds of things, video on demand. Like that's an absolute steal. Why aren't we doing it more, right? And so I think if anything, the skill and knowledge is available to us. The internet has really democratized and brought down the costs of doing that type of thing. I remember like 15 years ago, when you're trying to learn a copywriting course from like Frank Kern or Grant Cardone or what have you, you're going to be looking at like a $1,500 or $2,000 course, but to send you the actual DVDs to learn that type of thing. Now it's like a $10 streaming type of thing where you don't have to do that kind of thing anymore.
Yeah,
so
generally,
it's really just
most of Grant's stuff you can actually just find on YouTube for free.
absolutely right. But then it goes down to what we were talking about earlier, which is if you go try to put your own pieces of information together on a thing like YouTube, what you're losing is structure. What you're losing is curriculum. Where what are the fundamentals you need to learn first, and where do you go to next? And so it's absolutely a valid way to learn, but it leaves to the individual to come up with a curriculum in a sense of progression. Which is why going back to martial arts, that really helped me understand that if I were to go through something like my own, how do I learn this thing way better than the next guy? And it really did.
I think that you're right. The packaging, it's like a lot of people spend time doing jiu-jitsu, where they go into YouTube and they find the latest and greatest move of, everybody's doing buggy chokes all of a sudden. Right. And so that happens, but it's the integrating it into the game, where having the ecosystem of learning of other training partners and having a coach and having a system and a model to learn. I think that those small little changes, I don't think matter. I think when you're operating at the principles level rather than the mechanics side, the principles always win. And I think that's where I think it's really imperative.
I would say that's true. And I will also say that, the fundamentals also matter. So in a sense that where you have the foundations and the principles as like the guiding course, but sometimes it can feel very theoretical. So when you mix that with practical application, it's like, I think cooking is a really great example of that, because it's a kinesthetic experience where you learn how to cook. And so it's also something that you can learn just in time. So there's learning just in case something you need versus just in time. And a lot of theory and applications, and this comes across in chess a lot, where you learn a lot of opening theories versus if you learn a lot of like mid-game theories versus end-game theories, where you learn about those type of things. In an actual game, you're like, okay, I saw the YouTube video of how the other guy did the thing, but how do I do it like right here, right now? And so when you have that, that sort of transition from what I studied versus what I'm about to do, having a mix is really important. And so cooking is a really good example, because cooking is one of those environments where you can learn just in time. So the moment you see something, you can do it right away. And if you've got a good solid foundation, and then you go study the theory, you learn about like knife skills, you learn about, the different methods of cooking, and then you look at, or you can heat something, and you learn behind the science behind it. Those things mix with, like, it will be a great way to start, but it'll be a great way to supplement what you already have that's foundational to you. So knowing that sort of like differentiation into a particular field and the depth of that experience is super important.
Yeah, and I agree wholeheartedly with that, in the sense of, again, looking back to jiu-jitsu, is you need to trial it physically. You need to ensure, but whether I do a buggy choke or I do an Ezekiel or an armbar, it's irrelevant. It's just whatever fits into my game. So the idea is that those mechanics of what the actual technique is, those are just plug and play. Those are objects that you can relate to other things that you know. But the idea is the fundamentals of how you're going to package that game plan, that roadmap in your brain, so you know that when that happens, that you don't have to think, you can execute. I think that makes it so that it's a better situation.
That's right. And that's when you transition from, the techniques that you practice to something you internalize, and you're like, Yeah,
I think there's the four quadrants of knowing. It's like unconsciously don't know, then you consciously don't know, and then you consciously know, and then you unconsciously know. And if you follow that sort of path, I think that's anything, those are very good principles to follow.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Now you're doing right now, you're in the marketing space. So we do a lot of, things together from a perspective of, helping people grow and scale their business. What's the big number one thing to just leave on that side of for marketing that somebody needs to focus on?
Yeah, I mean, like we talk a lot about principles, right? And so for me, marketing right now, as I understand it, is marketing is sales at scale. So if you take a product that or service that a lot of people do this, right? You go to networking events and say, "Oh, what do you do?" And they explain a product or service, especially software, right?
Mhm.
They explain it, articulate it well, because if you don't articulate it well, someone's going to be confused. But you take it to a marketing site, next thing you know, they say something completely different. It's butchered, and so they're not clear, they're not concise, and they're not compelling. And so from a principles level, marketing is sales at scale. And so when we think about products and how to run advertising campaigns, it boils down to a few things really well that these days, especially is really important, is to get your data and tracking correct so that the things that you're measuring, you can look at it reliably and say, you know what, I can make a decision or guidance based on that, especially in a privacy-centric environment where platforms are making that a little bit harder to track. And I see a lot of brands make those type of mistakes because marketers aren't developers, and so they're not supposed to be technical to understand what the nuance of the platform restrictions are, and so those things really help. And related to that is the fact that a lot of advertising platforms use machine learning to guide their automated decisions. So on one hand, it removes a lot of the owner's decision making for media buyers of interpreting data to decide what to do next. But there are drawbacks where sometimes machines get trained in a certain direction because of random sampling, and being able to sort of intervene and take over those parts is really important. And so that gets into the account structures. We're getting a little bit technical here, but it gets to the account structure of how do you break up your accounts? How do you set up your campaigns? How many assets do you have? Which then ties into the last piece, which is finance, right? And so data, is important. Being technical to know how the tracking works and where it can mistrack. Those things are important. Being able to then lead to the account structures. Then it leads to finance, of being able to calculate the unit economics of what actually is profitable versus not. And then so I should have one more piece behind that, which is then you go into the actual experience of the consumer watching the ad, going to the landing page afterwards, and going through the transaction. And so being able to translate and tie all of that together, it's hard to do as a marketer, but what I found was uniquely helpful in my particular journey was because I came from a design background. I understand user and consumer experience and able to do user research. I got into analytics because of doing CRO and doing conversion optimization as a specialty. It helped me understand statistical significance and how data can tell me the wrong things, right? When I can trust it. Then I got into developer and software development, which helped me understood, events and, APIs and the nuance behind that of how something should or shouldn't fire. And then now when we're doing marketing and be able to deal with ad account structures, we can tie it all together of creating an ad creative that communicates quickly and clearly of how to best position a product or service in the best light so that we can get it really quickly. Then they go to a transaction or user or a landing page where the is relatively seamless. So it all ties together because that's what consumers experience.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I like the idea of really honing in on analytics. I think enough people don't, give that, they discount that process.
Yeah.
And sure, they get into action, but they don't measure the action. And then they get frustrated with the process, but because they don't have the systems to measure the actions, they can't diagnose without having those things up front. And it sometimes can be very difficult afterwards to try to capture that data.
For sure. There's two sort of pitfalls with data because most people feel very intuitive. We're like, well, I see numbers, I can read numbers, I understand it, right? So data, I like to say, doesn't tell you the truth. Data tells you what it helps you become less wrong about things. And so it could still be wrong, right? It's just less wrong. And so, what that means is that when you think about numbers and you say, oh, I got 5 conversions here or 10 conversions here, it's easy to look at that number because it's absolute, to take that number at face value. And it's harder to look at that number and see it as a random sampling, right? So when you go to casinos, for example, at the roulette table, you always see like, oh, the last 10 draws are like, oh, here's black and here's red. And then you're going to think that's going to be predictive in the future. But that's a lie. That's nothing to do with the future. But it's easy to look at those things and interpret data in the same way. And that's kind of the first part. But the second piece to it is that the event tracking and the aspect of what fires behind the scenes of what shows, like why are those numbers appearing on your screen, or what aspect of it are platforms making up those numbers in order for it to, fill in data gaps because there are platform issues. Those things are not intuitive, right? And again, it goes back to, it needs to be a little bit more technical. So if you take those numbers at face value and then make decisions based on that, it's very easy to get those things wrong. But it doesn't look like you're wrong because I'm being data driven. I see numbers and I'm doing things because of said numbers. It's a common problem.
Yeah, you're sort of lying to yourself because you're saying by virtue of just looking at numbers, the numbers got to be true. And this is how, when they look at census data or they look at these surveys, they surveyed, 1,000 people, and 1,000 people say that, Reese's Pieces is better than Oreo.
Yeah.
It just so happened that those 1,000 people also work at the Reese's Pieces factory.
Yes.
They left that element of that data set out. So sometimes the data is not going to actually tell you the information that you're looking for. You've got to look deeper past the data and why the data exists. Is there any errors in the data in the way that I'm perceiving the data? Yeah. Is it a large enough sampling? Real estate's notorious for this.
Yes.
Real estate produces all this data on, here's some market trends, here's, the average buying of a house. And especially in small markets like Canada, you'll have cities where people are making all these assumptive statements of the average price of a house in Canada went up by this much or down.
Yes.
And maybe that month it was just a couple houses, some really good kitchens were sold, whereas the month before it was a bunch of fixer-uppers.
Yes.
And there's not large enough data. I mean, you're talking thousands of units. We're not talking hundreds of thousands of units. So it's not your sampling size is so small.
Absolutely.
But yet all these big statements are made. These grandiose statements are made around such a small amount of data.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think but it's counterintuitive, right? It's hard to look at a number and tell me like if that's right or wrong. And so it's easy to presume that it's the right thing because the number said so. It feels like evidence. But it's when you like, when's the last time someone ran a real scientific experiment? Like, when's the last time you actually ran an experiment? What does it actually look like? Like, what are the options that when you run an experiment that of conclusions that you can make, right? Realistically, there's a difference versus there's no difference. Like, that's what you should really look at, right? But most people don't realize that there is an option for there is no difference. And so they just look at something and they're going to take everything at face value. It's just very counterintuitive to approach it that way because
it brings my favorite statement, which is all generalities are false. So if that statement is true, well, but if that statement is false, and that's how I look at data.
Yeah. And that's a good way to approach it, realistically.
Yeah. Well, dude, it's been great chatting with you, man. And I love what you're doing. I love the background that you have with Taekwondo. It's a beautiful martial art. I hope you do find your journey into another one, jiu-jitsu. And
not very subtle.
I never am. And but for people to get a hold of you, they get a hold of you at the 2x agency is where they would go to find you. Is there any other spots that you want to mark that they can reach out?
Yeah, for sure. And Steve, this is a fun chat for me too. So likewise, and I appreciate you making the plug. So 2x agency is a great way to find me. You'll see some of our past work. We do ad creatives as a service and media buying that's our bread and butter. But if you want to reach out to me directly, you can find me on Twitter. So I'm JTC Chan. I'm sure it's going to be posted in the show notes. And you can also look me up on LinkedIn. Also respond to that as well. Although looking for a John Chan on LinkedIn might be a little bit difficult. So I'm sure a link in the show notes would help that.
Link in the show notes will solve all those problems. I'm lucky with the Hamoen last name. There's very few.
Yeah, there's not a lot of you. There's quite a few of us.
Thank you very much for joining us. And guys, this is the Money, the Mindset, and the Mentoring podcast. We will see you on the next one.